In the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, Margaret Henderson's peaceful life with her golden retriever, Coconut, was about to take an extraordinary turn. Nothing could have prepared her for that crisp October morning when Coconut brought home a most unexpected friend. There, pressed against her backyard fence, was the most beautiful young bobcat she'd ever seen. Not hunting, not territorial, but gazing at Coconut with an expression that could only be described as pure adoration. Day after day, this wild creature returned, not for food or shelter, but for something far more precious: friendship. Their bond is a gentle reminder that love doesn't need words or walls. It only needs kindness, time, and an open heart. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Margaret Henderson had lived in the small town of Cedar Falls, Montana for 67 years. She'd seen drought years that cracked the earth like broken pottery, winters that froze pipes solid for weeks, and spring floods that sent deer tiptoeing through her vegetable garden. But in all those decades, she had never seen anything quite like what happened on that crisp October morning when her golden retriever, Coconut, brought home a friend. The warning signs had been there for weeks. Strange prints in the mud beside her back porch. Her neighbor's chickens clucking nervously through the night. The occasional glimpse of tawny fur darting between the pine trees that lined the back of her property. Margaret had figured it was probably a coyote. They'd been moving closer to town in recent years, following the easy pickings of garbage cans and pet food left outside. She'd been extra careful with Coconut's evening walks, keeping her on a leash and carrying her father's old flashlight. At 12 years old, Coconut was still spry enough to chase squirrels, but Margaret worried about her aging retriever tangling with something wild and dangerous. The morning it all changed started like any other. Margaret woke at dawn, made her coffee, and let Coconut out into the fenced backyard while she prepared breakfast. She was stirring scrambled eggs when she heard it, a sound she'd never heard Coconut make before. Not barking, not whining, but something between a purr and a chortle, full of delight and excitement. Margaret set down her spatula and peered through the kitchen window. Coconut was at the back fence, her tail wagging so hard her whole body wiggled. And there, just on the other side of the chain link, sat the most beautiful young bobcat Margaret had ever seen. Her first instinct was to rush outside and drag Coconut to safety. But something about the scene made her pause. The bobcat, clearly a juvenile, maybe 8 or 9 months old, was lying on his side, paws tucked under his chin, golden eyes fixed on Coconut with what could only be described as adoration. His tufted ears were forward, alert but not aggressive. His spotted coat gleamed in the morning sun. As Margaret watched, transfixed, the bobcat made a soft churring sound, almost like a house cat's purr, but deeper, wilder. Coconut responded with another of those strange chortle sounds, pressing herself against the fence. The young bobcat stretched one paw through the chain link, not to swipe, but to gently touch Coconut's nose. Margaret held her breath. This was impossible. Bobcats didn't just stroll up to domestic dogs for morning greetings. They were solitary creatures, cautious of humans and their pets. Yet here was this young male. She could tell by his size and the broader set of his face, acting more like a love-struck teenager than a wild predator. She stepped onto the back porch, her movement causing the bobcat's head to snap toward her. For a moment, they regarded each other across the yard. Margaret expected him to bolt, but instead, he simply watched her with those enormous golden eyes, his expression calm and unafraid. Then, As if satisfied that she posed no threat, he turned his attention back to Coconut. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes. The Bobcat played a gentle game with Coconut, reaching through the fence to bat at a stick she brought him, even rolling over to show his spotted belly when Coconut's excitement reached fever pitch. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he stood, touched noses with Coconut one last time, and melted into the trees. Margaret walked to the fence where Coconut still waited, hoping for her friend's return. "What in the world, girl?" she murmured, scratching behind her dog's ears. Coconut looked up at her with bright eyes, tail still wagging, as if to say, "Wasn't he wonderful?" That evening, Margaret called her son David in Seattle. A wildlife biologist, he'd always been her go-to for questions about the creatures that shared her mountain home. "Mom, that's unusual," David said after she described the morning's encounter. "Bobcats typically avoid domestic animals, especially dogs. He was probably just curious. I wouldn't worry about it unless he becomes aggressive." But the Bobcat returned the next morning, and the morning after that. By the fourth day, Margaret had stopped being surprised to find him waiting by the fence when she let Coconut out. She'd taken to watching from the kitchen window, marveling at the unlikely pair. The Bobcat, she'd started thinking of him as Bubba, a name that somehow suited his rugged appearance combined with his unexpectedly gentle nature, seemed to have adopted Coconut as his best friend. He'd arrive just after dawn, settle beside the fence, and wait. The moment Coconut bounded outside, his whole demeanor would change. His ears would perk up, his tail would twitch with excitement, and he'd make that strange churring sound. Their play sessions became more elaborate. Bubba would bring Coconut presents, a particularly nice stick, an interesting rock, once a bedraggled tennis ball he'd found somewhere. Coconut, not to be outdone, began carrying her toys to the fence to show him. Margaret watched them play a version of fetch, with Bubba batting objects back and forth through the chain link. The other neighbors had noticed too. Ellen Morrison, who lived next door, mentioned seeing the Bobcat crossing her yard. "Strangest thing," Ellen said over the fence one afternoon. "He just walked right past my chickens, didn't even look at them, almost like he was in a hurry to get somewhere important." That somewhere, Margaret realized, was her backyard. To see Coconut. As October turned to November, Margaret found herself genuinely looking forward to Bubba's visits. There was something magical about watching the growing friendship between her domestic dog and this wild creature. Coconut had been showing signs of her age, moving more slowly on walks, sleeping more, less interested in her toys. But Bubba's presence had given her new life. She waited by the fence every morning, whined with joy whenever she spotted him through the windows, and had more energy than she'd shown in months. The first time Bubba joined them on a walk, Margaret nearly turned around and went home. She was leading Coconut down the quiet dirt road that ran behind their property when she heard a rustle in the brush. Suddenly, Bubba emerged from the trees, falling into step about 20 feet behind them. Margaret's heart hammered, but Coconut was ecstatic, turning to look back at her friend every few steps. Bubba maintained his distance, never approaching the humans but clearly enjoying the shared walk. He'd disappear into the underbrush when they encountered other people or dogs, only to reappear once the coast was clear. Soon, his presence on their walks became routine. Martha Webb, the town librarian, stopped Margaret one afternoon as she was returning from a walk. "That Bobcat," Martha said, her eyes wide. "I've been hearing stories. People say he follows you and Coconut around like a guard dog." "He's harmless," Margaret replied, though she understood the concern. "He keeps his distance, never approaches people, never causes any trouble. That was true. Despite his growing boldness around Coconut and Margaret, Bubba remained wild enough to respect human boundaries. He never approached if there were children around, never lingered in yards where he wasn't welcome, and always gave humans plenty of space. The weather turned colder as November progressed. Margaret worried about Bubba spending nights outside, especially when the first snow began to fall. She'd started leaving a small covered area on her back porch, just in case. An old dog bed she'd found in the basement, protected by a plastic tarp. She never saw him use it during the day, but sometimes, when she woke in the morning, there would be a perfectly round depression in the bed and a few tawny hairs that caught the light. It was David who finally explained Bubba's behavior when he came home for Thanksgiving. "He's probably an orphan," David said, watching Bubba and Coconut play through the kitchen window. "Based on his size, I'd guess he's around 10 months old. If something happened to his mother when he was young, maybe 4 or 5 months, he would have had to learn to survive on his own. But he was still in that critical socialization period. Being around your house, seeing Coconut, it became normal for him." "So he's not dangerous?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Anyone could see the gentle nature of this particular wild animal. "Every wild animal is potentially dangerous, Mom. But this one..." David shook his head admiringly. "This one has chosen domesticity in a way. Not fully. He's still wild. But he's formed a bond that's overriding his instincts." As winter deepened, Margaret watched that bond grow stronger. Bubba began spending entire days in her yard when storms hit. She'd find him napping under the covered porch, Coconut curled up just inside the back door, both of them taking comfort in the other's proximity even with glass between them. The day Coconut got sick, Bubba seemed to know. Margaret had noticed her dog moving more slowly than usual, refusing her breakfast, lying in uncomfortable positions as if her joints ached. When she called the veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen confirmed what Margaret had feared. Coconut's arthritis was getting worse. At 13, she was experiencing the inevitable decline of age. That afternoon, as Coconut rested on her bed inside, Bubba appeared at the fence earlier than usual. He didn't wait for his usual playmate to come outside. Instead, he seemed to sense something was wrong. He paced the fence line, making soft sounds, not his usual chirr of greeting, but something more worried, more mournful. Margaret opened the back door. "She's resting, Bubba," she said softly. "She doesn't feel well today." As if he understood, the Bobcat settled beside the fence and waited. He stayed there all day, a faithful sentinel, even when it began to rain. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. She opened the back door and, after a moment's hesitation, unlatched the fence gate. "Come on," she said quietly. "She'd want to see you." Bubba approached slowly, his wild instincts warring with his desire to comfort his friend. He followed Margaret to where Coconut lay on her bed just inside the door. Without hesitation, he curled up beside her, still outside, respecting the boundary between wild and domestic, but close enough that Coconut could rest her head against his warm fur. They stayed like that through the night. Margaret dozed fitfully in her recliner nearby, marveling at the trust both animals had placed in her. When dawn broke, Bubba quietly slipped away, but not before gently nudging Coconut's face with his nose. A wild creature's version of a get-well kiss. Coconut's health improved with the medication doctor. Chen prescribed, and their routine resumed. But something had changed. The bond between all three of them, woman, dog, and Bobcat, had deepened beyond simple friendship. As winter gave way to spring, Margaret realized how profoundly Bubba had changed her life. She'd been lonely since her husband Harry's death 2 years ago. Coconut had been good company, but the house had felt too quiet, too empty. Bubba's presence had brought a sense of wonder back into her days. She found herself looking forward to mornings again, eager to see what new interaction would unfold in her backyard. The town had grown accustomed to their unusual friend, too. Children would sometimes ask their parents if they could come watch Bubba play with Coconut. Margaret always said yes, as long as they stayed at a safe distance. She'd seen how Bubba could bring the same sense of wonder to others that he'd brought to her. One afternoon in April, as Margaret was gardening, she heard Coconut's excited chortle. Looking up, she saw Bubba approaching, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, at a cautious distance, was another Bobcat, an adult female. Margaret's heart clenched. Was this his mother? Another wild cat who might lead him away? But as she watched, it became clear this was something different. The female was heavily pregnant, clearly nearing the end of her term. Bubba approached her fence, made his usual greeting sounds to Coconut, then turned back to the female. The exchange was brief, a few soft vocalizations, some gentle touching of noses. Then the female melted back into the forest. David was visiting that weekend. When Margaret described what she'd seen, he smiled. "He's introducing them," David said. "Bobcats typically live alone, but he's learned different behavior from watching you and Coconut. He's showing the female that this is a safe place." The female, Margaret started thinking of her as Belle, began appearing occasionally. Unlike Bubba, she maintained a much greater distance, but she seemed comfortable watching Bubba's interactions with the domesticated pair. In late April, she appeared again, this time with 2 tiny kittens. They stayed at the edge of the trees, but Margaret could see them clearly through her binoculars. Bubba approached his family, touched noses with each kitten, then returned to the fence where Coconut waited. It was then that Margaret understood the full scope of what had happened. Bubba hadn't just found friendship with Coconut. He'd found a model for how to be both wild and connected, how to maintain bonds across species, how to create family in unexpected ways. As spring progressed into summer, Margaret's backyard became a gathering place of sorts. Belle and the kittens would appear periodically, always keeping to the forest edge. Bubba continued his daily visits with Coconut. The neighbors grew accustomed to the sight, stopping by sometimes just to witness what one visitor called a daily miracle. Ellen Morrison brought her granddaughter one afternoon. "It's like a fairy tale," the little girl whispered. "A dog and a kitty cat being best friends, but the kitty cat is wild." That's exactly what it was, Margaret realized. A fairy tale made real, proving that connection and love could exist in the most unlikely circumstances. On Coconut's 14th birthday, a milestone Margaret hadn't been sure she'd reach, Bubba arrived with a present. A perfectly round stone, smooth from the creek, which he deposited ceremoniously at the fence. Coconut picked it up, carried it proudly around the yard, then brought it back to share with him. That evening, as Margaret watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Coconut sleeping peacefully on her bed, and Bubba resting just outside the open door, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. This unlikely friendship had shown her that isolation was a choice, that family could take any form, and that wonder could appear at any moment. You just had to be open to seeing it. Bubba never did become domesticated. As autumn returned, then winter again, he remained wild at heart. But every day, without fail, he returned to the fence where Coconut waited. Their friendship had created ripples throughout the community, reminding everyone that love didn't require similarity, that trust could bridge any divide, and that sometimes the most profound connections came from the most unexpected places. As Margaret settled into her second year of this magical routine, she knew that whatever time she had left, whether years or decades, would be blessed by the daily proof that miracles were real. They arrived quietly, on 4 paws, at dawn, and asked for nothing more than an open heart and a place to call home. In Cedar Falls, Montana, where the town motto was, "Where mountain meets prairie," a new legend had been born. It wasn't written in any official record, but everyone knew the story of Bubba and Coconut, the wild bobcat and gentle golden retriever who proved that friendship knows no boundaries. And every morning, when the sun crested the mountains and painted the valley in gold, Margaret Henderson would make her coffee, let her dog outside, and wait for their miraculous friend to appear at the fence, ready for another day of impossible, beautiful friendship. In loving memory of all the unlikely friendships that teach us that home isn't just a place. It's wherever love is freely given and gratefully received.